So I was listening to a podcast this morning about the English Civil War, and it starts off by, kind of setting the stage, and it makes a couple of claims that I'm not sure I totally agree with. One of them is that the Protestant Reformation begins with Martin Luther, and another is that the Protestant Reformation arrives in England when Henry VIII breaks off from the Catholic Church in order to divorce his wife. I don't think those two claims stand well on their own. That they function as kind of an argument that requires them to be held as a specific beginning point. So there's two things that I find that we do in history that work at kind of cross purposes. One of them is this insistence on this kind of Thomas Kuhnish paradigm shift. We always have to find the paradigm shift. So like England is going along happily and merrily as Catholics until, Henry VIII needs to divorce his wife, and then boom, paradigm shift, The other is kind of the opposite, that everything ties back to something previous, and so, if this doesn't begin here, here's this thing that kind of, if we look at it the right way, kind of vaguely resembles what we're talking about later, and so, look, here it is before, and I think both of those are kind of misleading, potentially. The Protestant Reformation begins with Martin Luther. Well, sure, if we're going to talk about it in a certain way, but in other ways, it predates him. And Luther just kind of arrives at the right place in the right time, and with the conditions established for the schism that he ends up being seen as the leader of. And so how those conditions are established are important. But that doesn't mean that we should find the Protestant Reformation before the Protestant Reformation, I guess. So it's not that it's not true or that it's incorrect, but also it doesn't make those things that come before it less important. There is centuries of reform, centuries of appeals for reform before the Protestant Reformation is successful. And so that ends up being what we're really talking about, is when does reform become a successful, self-sustained movement? And even that is problematic. So I think it depends on the argument that you're trying to make and why you need Luther to function as this thing, the beginning. I think if we examine it, it would turn out that Luther is not the beginning, but he's not just a different version of the same thing that's gone before. That he's making use of things that have happened before and reimagining them and re-expressing them in ways that are unique to him, to his period, to his context. So it's not wrong to say that the Protestant Reformation begins with Luther, but it just depends on what we're using that argument to say. Are we saying that there was no clamor for reform before Luther? That's kind of a difficult position to hold when we think of things like the Holy Roman Emperor, several Holy Roman Emperors going to war with the Pope, and at least one of them even installing his own Pope. And there's a potential schism there, and clamor for reform, and political infighting, and all the things that we see later in the Protestant Reformation. It's just that they end up dying out or rather they don't take the shape that the Protestant Reformation does. And so, because we can't find the Protestant Reformation in its entirety before the Protestant Reformation, then we tend to dismiss important precursors or important forms that went before that could have. And then the other one, that the Protestant Reformation doesn't make it to England until Henry VIII, is also problematic. You have Thomas More, who's famous for his opposition to Henry VIII's break with the Catholic Church, who gets kind of appropriated later by the Catholic faith as this heroic martyr for Catholicism. But Thomas More is best buds with, and to some degree a fanboy of, Erasmus. And they are important people clamoring for reform within the Catholic Church. And when the Protestant Reformation breaks out, some Protestants tend to see Erasmus as this guy who betrayed them, who laid the groundwork for them, but didn't have the courage or the follow through that they had to see the thing through. Plus, you could go back centuries, even before Henry VIII. You go back to Henry II and find the monarchy in contention with the Catholic Church over where one's powers begin and the others end. So it's not so simple to say that the Protestant Reformation begins here and arrives in England here. There's important things that are going on before that set the conditions. And while those things are not, the Protestant Reformation in carbon copy before the Protestant Reformation and the Protestant Reformation in England, they are important forerunners that make it difficult to say, this is where it begins. And I guess the takeaway from this is that when we say this is where it begins, what we're really saying is this is when it began to be successful. This is when it began to be irresistible. And that also has the danger of being teleological and implying inevitability. But really, that's what we're doing. We're not really talking about this Thomas Kuhn paradigm shift. We're talking more about this is where the tables were turned. Not that these things weren't there before and that people after didn't make use of the things that were there before, but this is where the balance shifts. That's what I think. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. What do I know? If I knew anything, I wouldn't be walking to work at some menial job at 5:30 in the morning.